So in an age of climate disaster, we are now at a fork in the road. We can keep doing recovery the old way, where disasters are followed by a scrambled panic that leaves those with the least with even less. Or we can make a deep shift towards building resilience year-round with Indigenous and ancestral knowledge at the center of our curriculum, advancing major social equity goals as we do it.
Aloha. I have the privilege to introduce our speaker. I first wanted to say mahalo to all the students and the staff that made the speaker series possible. The Better Tomorrow speaker series will have a focus on resilience in the upcoming speaker series, so definitely join us for other great speakers to come. Our sponsors are a joint venture between UH Manoa, the Hawaii Community Foundation, the Learning Coalition, and Kamehameha Schools. So thanks again to our sponsors for making this all happen. So I get to introduce our speaker, and I hope that you guys all read his bio already, and that's why you're here, or at least your +1 gave you a little lowdown on who this amazing speaker is. And if you didn't, do like I did, and I Googled him, and I Instagrammed him, and I tried to find out as much as I could about who this wonderful person is. And of course, we only bring great speakers, right? And one thing, so I'm not gonna give you his bio, because you should have done that already. I do wanna say what isn't in his bio is, and what is not on Google or Instagram is Saket taking Instagram photos and selfies of himself doing his work and in response and relief efforts. He, in his bio, it alludes to it a little bit. It doesn't mention how humble he is. He is one of the people that you want to come to help your community after a devastation like we had in Lahaina. We had a lot of people that came in to our community, a lot of people to help and really be there for our people, but a lot of people that came in to save us. A lot of people that came in to take the selfie and say, look what I'm doing for my community. Look what I'm doing to save these people. And so I was a little nervous about having the speaker series or having Saket come to Maui because we had a lot of it. And I think getting to learn a little bit about who he was really made me feel a lot better that this is the type of people that I would love to learn from. I was able to share dinner with him yesterday and pick him up and hang out with him a little bit today, and never once did he ever say I. He has this amazing spirit that is just like us. Like in Hawaii, I say this is a kako thing. He said it earlier today in our reception we had earlier, but it's not him doing the work. It's the people that he surrounds himself with, the people that are a part of his team. And so I just wanted to mahalo him for that ano, that spirit that he brings to chasing disasters and really being there to help center relief and response on community, on equitable relief and recovery efforts after a climate disaster. And so thank you very much to Saket Soni for coming to speak to us today, and I would love to learn about what he does across the nation. But he has said he wants to learn from us to be able to take that and show the world what we did here, what we do, how we respond to disasters, from the volcanoes, from Kauai flooding, and then now in Lahaina. So mahalo to everything you're doing in your neck of the woods. Everybody that's here are amazing people in your own right and what you've done for your communities. And so I'd like to welcome Saket Soni to the stage so we can Yeah, just get to know you and your work a little better.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for that amazing introduction. And I am so excited to visit communities that have been recovering and rebuilding in Maui tomorrow. And I'm really, really honored to be here because, I have been embedded in disasters and disaster recoveries for about 6 or 8 months a year with my team since 2006, so almost 20 years. And I'm a labor organizer. I spend my time in disaster zones because I work to protect the workers who are doing the rebuilding and repairs. I'll talk today about resilience, but first, I want to tell you about a place you've probably never heard of, a place that I've just flown in from, a place where I saw some very special things happen, a place quite different from the one we're in today. It's a place called Morgan City. It's about an hour and 20 minutes out from New Orleans. It's a shipyard town in Louisiana. 11,000 people live there, pretty small. Its primary industries are shrimp processing and petroleum. In fact, the biggest event of the year there is the annual Shrimp and Petroleum Festival. Its centerpiece is a beauty pageant. So every year, a lucky person is crowned Miss Shrimp and Petroleum. The oldest fine dining institution in town is the Petroleum Club. It's a members-only club. It was started by shipping and petroleum tycoons many, many decades ago. And since I've been spending a lot of time there, I called them and tried to join. My application was declined. And so this is a town with a very old power structure. And the reason I've been spending time there in Morgan City is because of Francine, Hurricane Francine, that is. A month ago, a storm that passed through Louisiana poured torrents into 4 neighborhoods of Morgan City. And I want to tell you about a family I met there while I was door knocking flooded residents. My team and I spent about 10 days talking to residents, and one of the most beautiful sets of people we met there is a couple I'll call Jim and Betty. So Jim and Betty live in a house that's been in Jim's family since 1942. 4 generations have lived there. They've weathered every storm and hurricane for 80 years. Their house isn't big, but it's all they have. They share it with 5 kids. They live paycheck to paycheck on Jim's job at Domino's Pizza in town. And so this house really is very important to them. And now the hurricane has punched holes into its roof. Every wall was waterlogged when I saw it. Every room was moldy. But when I showed up, despite the conditions they were living in, despite the cleanup they were doing, despite the fact that their place was a shambles, tiles were falling off, floors were flooded, the entire attic had come apart. Despite all of that, they welcomed me like an old friend. The next day, I came back with 9 Waffle House breakfasts because their glass stovetop had cracked and they hadn't had a warm meal in a while. They hosted me, and they didn't talk about their problems. They let me into their lives. Jim told me about his family's history in that house since 1942. They told me their love story, the way they met. Their meet cute was 24 years ago. And they said that they hadn't spent a full day apart since. I can't quite imagine that, but that is incredible. Betty told me about the nodule that her doctors had found last year on her lung and about the difficulties that Jim was having with his health. They shared their grief over losing their parents. And at the end of it all, I asked if I could help, and instead they wanted to give me a ride. They sent me off with chocolate fudge that they had made just before the hurricane. I was deeply moved, but I was also really worried about them. A new storm was expected the next day, and it would certainly rain right into their house. And already another hurricane was beginning to gather in the Atlantic. Everybody was talking about it. I think some of you have been in communities like this where, storms and fires, whatever it is, they're just on people's mind 6 months out of a year. And people were listening to the news and waiting for this gathering storm above the Atlantic. Now, Jim and Betty couldn't afford repairs to their house, and FEMA help was weeks away at best, maybe months away. So the next day, I returned with one of my members, an immigrant worker named Josue. That day, Josue got up and put a tarp on Jim and Betty's roof for free as a volunteer because they couldn't afford it. He covered it snugly with tarp to protect it from future rain. And Jim and Betty slipped easy last night. Because he did this for free to express gratitude, Jim the next day smoked sausage in his backyard. There's this Louisiana pork called tasso, which is a wonderful smoked pork that goes well with sausage, and he made a lot of it. Betty cooked gumbo. She fed us, and within 3 days, we had gone from being strangers to friends in the backyard of this home that had just taken a beating from a hurricane. And as Josue and I were pulling away from their house in Josue's truck, he turned to me and he told me something that he was too afraid to tell Jim and Betty. He said they had a worse problem than the cracks in their roof. The entire house, the trusses, the rafters, the walls, the flooring, were all damaged. All of it, he said, were rotten. Now, he's a person who has been rebuilding homes after hurricanes for close to 20 years. He knows his stuff. And he delivered a terminal diagnosis. He said that in a gusty storm, that house would probably fall right on that family. He said, that house cannot stand. That's what he told me. Jim and Betty are on the far side of what I call the resilience divide. It's well known by now that climate disasters are unequal. Hurricanes, floods, and fires have the worst impacts on those with the fewest resources. We know that very well. Disasters are worse for the poor. What's less known is that recoveries drive inequality. And that's what I want to talk about today. The color and class of recovery. Recoveries, what I see is those already wealthy emerge from recovery efforts with greater wealth than before. But recoveries make poor people even poorer. Families like Jim and Betty's, the uninsured, the underinsured, renters, rural families, these people who are mostly disproportionately people of color, although Jim and Betty are white, those people come out worse. Recovery, the way at least we do it as a nation, is a hidden driver of inequality. It's not stark to say, I think, that for the poor, recovery is a kind of robbery. I first saw the resilience divide in New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. That's where our work has its roots. I started as a labor organizer after Katrina turned the U.S. Gulf Coast into the world's largest construction site overnight. There were over 1 million homes to be rebuilt in Louisiana, over 1 million more in Mississippi, and I was there to protect the workers carrying out those repairs. My days would start at 6:30 in the morning under a 60-foot-tall monument to Robert E. Lee. Lee's Circle, the center of the business district, had turned into a massive hiring hub where hundreds of workers would gather. Contractors would pull up in buses. They would pick up workers. They would drive out to distant, still dark corners of the Gulf Coast. And I'd hop on those buses with them to get a worm's eye view of recovery efforts. So here's how the resilience divide worked. Evacuees returned to the city to find that when the floodwaters had receded, their greatest threat wasn't mold or flooding, it was developers and profiteers. We saw a decade of land fights that pushed poor people out of their homes, as much of the new housing stock was aimed at building not the people who lived there, but wealthier buyers. It played out in another way. Workers doing this recovery and rebuilding work were largely migrant workers. Most of them were undocumented. And these were my members. These were the people I was organizing. They were locked into deeply exploitative conditions. But local residents couldn't even get to those jobs. Immigrant workers were locked into exploitation, but local residents were locked out of the rebuilding efforts altogether. So along with the loss of home, they shared a loss of livelihood. They stared into long-term and structural unemployment, even as they lived in the middle of the largest construction site in the world. So in the decade that followed Katrina, disasters became more frequent and more destructive. As more hurricanes hit, the workers who rebuilt the Gulf Coast traveled to new towns and new cities to repair and rebuild. They became an itinerant workforce, much like the farm workers who traveled from harvest to harvest. Each time workers followed storms, my team and I followed workers, and each time I saw new iterations of the resilience divide. I saw it, for example, in Florida, where disasters have brought so much FEMA money into the state that it's actually raised the state's GDP. But that money is reaching wealthier homeowners, not poor and working class homeowners, not renters, many of whom are disproportionately low-wage workers in town, many of whom are disproportionately Black and Latino and other people of color. Then came the wildfires in California, and many of the workers we represented in the Gulf Coast who had been building after hurricanes crisscrossed state lines to come to the West and help rebuild. And we saw it again. Those hit hardest by the wildfires have been the poorer residents, of course, like the agriculture and hotel workers in places like Sonoma County. These are people who can't fund their own repairs or move to adjoining counties where the cost of living is astronomical, even by California standards. And farm workers were already struggling with the effects of climate change, since ever longer wildfire seasons meant shorter harvest periods and less work. And then there's your old experience with the resilience divide here in Hawaii, and in Maui in particular. You've seen it with the fires, where a major question has been and is going to be, whose recovery is it? Who is the recovery for? Will it be a recovery that prioritizes those who permanently live here, who reside here, or will the recovery largely be developer-driven and tailored to the preferences who have second home here? Will the recovery right the wrongs of historical injustices or compound them? And that's really the driving questions about American recovery everywhere after disasters. So, how does the resilience divide work? How do the very recoveries that are supposed to help end up hurting, driving people deeper into poverty? So let's go back into Morgan City to take a close-up look at it. Jim and Betty are facing an even bigger crisis than they yet know. Their house is on the brink of collapse. A large part of the reason for that is because, after every previous hurricane, FEMA would refuse to fund their repairs on the grounds of pre-existing conditions. That's one of the standards. Now, I'll talk a little bit about FEMA, but when I do, just understand that, Congress writes the rules of disaster recovery. There's an agency that implements it, and a lot of times, and I've run into a lot of frontline FEMA workers, people who have told me that they've gone from, the 9/11 to the fires in California, to the hurricanes in the South, to the Midwestern floods. FEMA workers have told me that between these home visits, they sit in their cars and cry for the residents, for the tragedies that they witness. So I'm using shorthand here when I say FEMA. I'm really talking about the rules of recovery written by Congress. The frontline face on those rules, though, is a worker who comes down to inspect your home and tell you how taxpayers can fund it, how taxpayers can help. And when Hurricane Ida hit Jim and Betty's house, when previous hurricanes hit, FEMA told them that they couldn't fund their repairs on the grounds of pre-existing conditions. But those pre-existing conditions were damage from previous hurricanes. Those pre-existing conditions were poverty and the disinvestment in rural Louisiana. And so while Betty and Jim were trapped in a vicious cycle, wealthier residents were able to self-fund repairs while waiting for insurance or government money to kick in, to come through. Meanwhile, many insured homeowners in Morgan City faced a different dilemma. In other neighborhoods in Morgan City where I went, so for example, I went to a predominantly African-American neighborhood, which in this town is literally called Across the Tracks. There is a sign that says Across the Tracks, and there across the tracks is the historical segregated African-American neighborhood where, some of the homes were insured. I met an older gentleman named Henry who did have insurance, but his house fell through the cracks in a different way. After paying his insurance premiums for decades, his provider told him he wasn't covered for this kind of water damage. He was insured by that provider for 60 years. 60 years when that insurer walked away. And in the week he spent arguing with them, mold spread everywhere, so badly that his entire house needs to be gutted. What was a maybe $35,000 to $45,000 repair job has now turned into a $200,000 repair job in the time that it took for the insurance company to decide what to do. So multiply these dilemmas of Jim and Betty and Henry by 1,000,000, and you start to understand the resilience divide. When the payors do pay out, it can take years for the money to arrive. Wealthier people can bridge the gap themselves, but people like Jim and Betty and Henry can't. What happens to them is a case study in cumulative disadvantage. Over the course of years, or months, or sometimes in the course of a single week, residents like them fall deeper and deeper into disadvantage. When a recovery check is too little or too late, residents lose their homes. When government help invests in hotel vouchers instead of rebuilding their homes permanently, those hotel stays extend to a year or 18 months. In that time, residents hemorrhage savings. When long-term rebuilding is left to the market, residents invariably have to move as developers come in and property values rise. So residents spend more money to commute for hours to their old jobs. The Waffle House job that was 10 or 20 minutes away is now 2 hours away. And eventually, many of our residents become strangers in the very communities they helped build, they helped run, the places where they spent their lives. And the recovery has made them poorer and more disadvantaged. But again, not for lack of money. As hurricanes, floods, and fires get more frequent and destructive, recovery is becoming big business. That's the other aspect of what I want to talk about. Recoveries are a deeply profitable wealth-building machine, just not for the poor people who are at the center of those impacted. Since Hurricane Katrina, there have been over $200 billion disasters. That is, disasters that cost $1 billion or more to rebuild. Americans lose so many homes to disasters each year that we spend over $100 billion a year now on repairs. The passage of the bipartisan infrastructure deal and the Inflation Reduction Act is set to steer $1 trillion or more towards meeting our decarbonization goals and making our nation climate resilient. And all this money that's now flowing has turned resilience into an entire economy. It's what we call the resilience economy. And right now, it's an economy of winners and losers, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's still time to turn it around. Recoveries don't have to drive inequality or deepen poverty. We can turn this economy into a source of prosperity and indeed for justice. So how do we do it? Well, we have a profound opening. There is a lot of literature out there that talks about disasters as metaphors for different kinds of tragedy and experience. I am not a big fan of talking about disasters as metaphors. Disasters simply are the disasters that they are. They're simply tragic. For those impacted, their loss, their pain, their grief. Sometimes they are the end of life. Sometimes they are the end of a way of life. When we are victims, disasters aren't opportunities. They aren't silver linings. They aren't half-full glasses. They just aren't any of that. And yet, disasters do present profound openings in which we can change our lives. Think about any time you have received, or a loved one has received, a disastrous diagnosis. Or think about a phone call that you got delivering terrible news about a loved one, or a terrible loss in your community. What happens after that? We are startled back into focusing on what was important. We realize we need to reassess our life's priorities, to focus on the important things, to spend time and be in community with people we care about, to use our time on earth for a purpose, and above all, to love, to be intimate with those we love. Now, thousands of people are going through that together after climate disasters. And that presents an opening for new priorities in a whole society. And as disasters are rising, millions of people are realizing that we actually do need resilience. There's more and more political will that's getting behind the idea of resilience. There's more and more money getting behind the idea of paying for it. But we're at a moment where the field of resilience is still very nascent. Resilient still means a lot of different things to different people. The definition isn't settled. To some people, it means engineering. To some people, it means durable materials. I've been in hundreds of hours more than I would like to in conversation about hardy boards and plywood and sheetrock and forms of insulation and tassels and trussels and roofs and rafters, you name it. Mostly these are men talking about, Home Depot materials. So that is a lot of the way that resilience is talked about and understood. Another way it's talked about is as a spiritual reserve, as a source of personal strength. Some people I know really reject the word because they feel very deeply that it's an excuse that, after a disaster happened, people came and rolled all over us, and now they want us to be resilient. So there's also a little bit of an indignation at being responsible for being resilient, when in fact, we need to just spend time being in pain. And all of that is valid. All of those are absolutely valid definitions of resilience. But we have an opening right now to make resilience mean something more than all of that. If disasters compound historical inequalities, our job together is to build the kind of resilience that reverses those inequalities. That should be our common project as a field. So to do that, first, we need to rewrite the rules of disaster recovery to bridge the resilience divide. So take, for example, the rule that drove Jim and Betty back in Morgan City into poverty. Their house had been through every hurricane since 1942. 3 years ago, there was a big one, Hurricane Ida. They didn't qualify for home repairs, for roof repairs, because their roof was leaking before Ida hit. FEMA called that a pre-existing condition, and those weren't covered by government repairs. And so this time around, when Hurricane Francine hit last month, Jim and Betty were worried that FEMA would say the same thing, that they would lose even more value on their house. But they were surprised because in January of this year, the Biden-Harris administration changed the rules of recovery to cover pre-existing conditions. Jim and Betty are now eligible for help, and we've got a fighting chance to keep them in that house. Now that's extraordinary. That's two real people trying to figure out where they will go next, and what this new rule means is that they can stay. Now, Other rules need to be rewritten similarly to make sure renters, uninsured people, underinsured homeowners, the houseless, those in rural America, all of those are included in recovery. But we need to go further than that. We need public investment in preparation before disaster, in true resilience. The US Army Corps of Engineers used to think that 3 million homes in America were at high risk of flooding. Today, that estimate is over 10 million. In the Gulf Coast, we've launched a community organizing approach to resilience, an effort to knock on the doors of those at-risk homes, engaging the residents. In a broad resilience agenda, we're listening deeply to them, to the residents, to understand their problems, to unlock their expertise, their experience. We're gaining detailed, granular knowledge of where the public resources can solve for persistent poverty and how to concentrate them on the 50% of the communities over the divide that need the help the most. That's a head-on attack on the resilience divide. And we're building a political mandate. In deep red states, we're utilizing this opening to change people's minds, to have conversations about public money, the role of government, the idea of a public option for recovery and resilience, and about climate change. Second thing we're doing is building a resilience workforce. And I want to talk about that for a minute because that's the heart of our work. For close to 20 years, I've organized workers who do the heroic work of helping people come home after hurricanes, floods, and fires. They're the lifeline of these communities. Without them, homeowners would never come back, and taxpayers would leave, and a whole community would death spiral. So these workers really are America's blood cells, white blood cells, but there are far too few of them, and the need for them is only growing. So to meet this need, we are building a new American profession for the climate era. You know, every era in US history has led to new industries, agriculture, and then industrialization. Each of these eras led to new industries that emerged new workforces. These workforces, when they emerged, were thought of as informal, as low wage. We thought there were only going to be 400 people building cars in Detroit, and the fad would pass. And when all the 400 wealthy, tycoons who needed cars got cars, then that industry would go away. And today, auto workers are part of the spine of the American middle class. We thought similarly about other industries that have emerged. Healthcare, the industries out of Silicon Valley. There weren't going to be too many personal computers until there were, and now that's a whole industry. Well, in the context of the resilience economy, in the context of climate change that is creating extraordinary labor need to meet our non-negotiable decarbonization goals and our non-negotiable resilience goals, we need a whole new profession. And we're building that formalized profession in America. We're calling it the Climate Resilience Technician. And we've built a national apprenticeship program to look at how we can train apprentices to become professionalized, skilled, and certified workers to build 3 different kinds of resilience. The resilience of the built environment, the resilience of the natural environment, and the resilience of communities. Our apprentices train for year-round work in building resilience. Over the past few years, for example, New Orleans has seen intersecting climate and economic and health crises after 2 hurricanes in quick succession during the pandemic. So, like Hawaii, New Orleans runs on the service sector and tourism, both of which collapsed. We took service industry workers who were left unemployed because of the pandemic, and we retrained them through our program, and we turned them into resilience technicians to perform an entire spectrum of resilience work, from construction to community outreach. And we set them on a career path in a whole new source of higher-paying year-round jobs. These workers lost jobs in the service sector that paid them $7.25 an hour. Their resilience technician jobs started them at $24 an hour. In Northern California, Thank you. That was the applause, by the way, goes to a whole incredible array of people, just to show you the profound ways in people the profound ways in which people can change. It is really, really hard to reappraise a worker in an economy. It's very hard, particularly with low-wage workers. Women and people of color get thought of in our economic imagination as naturally low-wage, when in fact there are structural reasons why their wages are few and their benefits are little. We managed to reposition these workers because of the opening that disasters provide, and because of the leadership of a lot of different people, industry, the city, and many, many people in between. Another example, in Northern California, after 5 years of devastating wildfires, we went to the places where people were hit the hardest, where people can't self-fund recovery. We honed in on Sonoma County, where our partner, North Bay Jobs with Justice, already had a deep base of farm workers. Those farm workers were sinking deeper into poverty because of, as I said, the shrinking harvest season because of climate change. So now, California is also a place that, many of you perhaps know this, this is a place that has outlawed a lot of indigenous resilient practices to pursue rampant construction. So we've taken farm workers who are indigenous people from Oaxaca and are retraining them, but that retraining consists of re-emerging their own indigenous land management practices in partnership with botanists and ecologists, so that they are becoming climate resilience technicians doing land management work year-round, funded by the state. As farm workers, they earn $17.50 an hour. As newly trained climate resilience technicians, they're earning $35 an hour. This is all a measure of the fact that the labor demand is being felt widely across many, many sectors of society. So back to Morgan City, there was a beautiful little glimpse last week of the potential of local people to enter resilience careers and change their lives. I told you about the worker I brought to Jim and Betty's house who put tarp on their roof. His name is Josue. He's an immigrant from Honduras. He came up with a plan to rebuild that house from the inside in a way that would keep Jim and Betty in it and their 3 kids living there while he did the construction. One of those kids is a young 20-year-old named Paul. He works part-time at the local grocery store. He was fascinated looking at Josue on that roof, fascinated by the work, fascinated by this really cool magnetic hammer where you can, just stick the end of a nail and hammer away. And this young man, Paul, he came up to me sheepishly almost and said, "Wow, could I learn to do that?" And Josue heard him and didn't hesitate. He said, "I'll teach you, and you come work with me." And so this is even more remarkable because Jim and Betty and Paul are Trump supporters. And Josue is an undocumented immigrant. And we're training not just Paul, but a cohort of 20 or 30 residents in that town, not just for roofing work, but to go door to door as resilience caseworkers, helping people fill out FEMA appeals, helping people learn how to measure the humidity levels in their own house, the beginnings of good year-round work. And that unexpected moment of connection between Paul and Josue brings us to the third and perhaps the most surprising thing we've been able to build, which is not just homes, not just land management, but new kinds of social cohesion and bonding. That's the real opening after disasters. The kind of opening that led Jim and Betty to share their lives with me and Josue, which is remarkable. We've made a project out of turning these spontaneous moments of connection into long-lasting relationships, so that the resilience workforce, Paul and Josue and many others side by side, can be the basis of a new civic fabric. I see this all the time in red states. Immigrant workers arrive to rebuild for residents who once thought of immigrants as the enemy. But this is not just about immigration. Immigration is salient right now because it's part of a terrible political climate and because A small group of people becomes a political football. But this is not about the border. This is not about legal papers. This is about the way that resilience work can be the basis for building new bonds that transcend the politics of the day to build a stronger democracy. I think about a gentleman I met in Florida, in the Panhandle. The story I've heard from many communities. In a very small, unincorporated town in the Florida Panhandle, there was a gentleman who'd had the same job for 40 years and the same commute for 40 years. His commute consisted of a straight line between himself and a mortuary in which he worked. Well, after the hurricane hit and his house was falling apart, when it got dark, he got increasingly disoriented. And one night, he was driving back home, and he had to pull over because he forgot where he lived. He forgot his way home. His way home was a very direct line from his workplace, and yet his home became profoundly strange to him. That's a very, very deep experience, something that's been shared with me many times. And after he had it that night, he went home and he put up a sign on his fence. That sign said, "Strangers will be shot." And a week later, I showed up at his door, a complete stranger, and I showed up with 20 other strangers. And we offered to rebuild his house. And we did. On a glorious sunny Sunday, saws were buzzing and hammers were hammering, and this gentleman was grilling meat in the backyard. And after that, he and his family invited us to stay for dinner. And we told stories, and at the end of that dinner, that family took that sign down. And that's the real opening after disasters. In a nearby town, a Republican mayor who had run on an anti-immigrant platform only months before started coming out to the Home Depot lot where workers gathered in the morning to thank them and hand out water and ask how she could support them. In Louisiana, a community church once took a worker in after he fell from a parishioner's roof, and the parish, the parishioners spent weeks nursing him back to health. When the worker recovered, he came back with a whole team to rebuild that community's church from the ground up. Again and again, that's what I see. Hope being born out of pain. Because of the unlikely bonds that form after disasters. That's how we start, not just to build homes, but to build hope. So in an age of climate disaster, we are now at a fork in the road. We can keep doing recovery the old way, where disasters are followed by a scrambled panic that leaves those with the least with even less. Or we can make a deep shift towards building resilience year-round with Indigenous and ancestral knowledge at the center of our curriculum, advancing major social equity goals as we do it. We can move from the resilience divide to greater economic and racial equity. We can build a 1 million-strong workforce with women and men in it, with the formerly incarcerated and the undocumented, with rural and urban communities, with Native people, with people from all walks of life, in family-supporting jobs, performing year-round preparation and adaptation work, ushering in a new era of climate resilience. And while we're at it, we can reweave the fabric of our democracy and new relationships that bridge our divides and return us to deep interdependence. And maybe as we do this, like we're doing it in California and in Louisiana and in Florida, maybe along the way we can remember that this is how we were always meant to work and live. We were always meant to be connected. We can share a vision of resilience as work that doesn't break us, but connects us to each other, to nature, and to purpose. I am continually inspired in my work by your poet laureate, Brandy Nalini McDougall, who wrote these lines. There was a time before they were bent under the need to make an honest living, when each frond was bound by its life to another, like a long, erect fin skimming the surface of a seagrass and sand. May we all stand tall in our aspiration to earn an honest living, and may we all stay connected as we make our communities not just whole in a recovery process, but resilient and looking forward. Thank you all. I am so thrilled to be here. It's an honor to be among you all. And my big question to you now is, how are you all thinking about recovery and resilience here almost a year, a little more than a year after the fires? And how are you all thinking about resilience in your communities in the decades to come? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing immersion into your life and your work. Thank you for letting me go first, Robert. So I was really interested to hear your work with Indigenous communities and their role in resilience work. And so I just kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about how your work bases community support and community first and Indigenous solutions to climate resilience.
The way that the work in California started was that a group of farm workers started to report to their organizers that the supervisors in wine country were trying to get to them to work faster and faster. This was in the context of the fires. Harvest season was getting shorter and shorter. Workers were losing work, but wineries were also losing extraordinary amounts of money. And there was a very deep set of organizers with deep relationships with these farm workers who started to realize that they needed to build a bridge to the next economy for these workers. That for thousands and thousands of workers, they needed to build a bridge to good work that wasn't based on farm labor. Now, that organization, North Bay Jobs with Justice, is very deeply rooted in the community, and I think that's one of the key ingredients. I don't think that those kinds of conversations with workers are worth their weight in gold with workers and communities, where people are telling you the little details of what's happening in their day. And the organizers there were there for those conversations. And what they realized was that part of what the farm workers were expressing to them wasn't just the difficulty they were facing. They were expressing deep sorrow and sympathy for the land that they were tilling. They were expressing extraordinary sorrow for the ways that their working faster was hurting the ground that they were working on. And although the industry saw them as farm workers, and although perhaps society saw them as immigrants, their primary identity really was as indigenous people from Oaxaca. And they had ancestral land management knowledge. And so the project in Sonoma County took all that knowledge and partnered with a set of ecologists and botanists and community organizations to create an entirely new sets of cohorts of people who would no longer work just farm labor, but would transition through the trainings to become resilience technicians, doing land management, or as it's called there, vegetation management. Meanwhile, the state of California put a lot of money into that, so people were getting grants to carry out that on hundreds and hundreds of acres of land. And previously, this was thought of as, volunteer work or something you could get young people to do on summer vacation. And absolutely, I'm a big fan of young people doing difficult things in their summer vacation. But this actually required professional training and work. It required a level of skill. And so a project started to emerge that's now getting bigger and bigger And we're still learning from all of it. But the most profound lesson, I think, has been how much a group of people who were thought of as low wage and as good as their labor on any given day became really repositioned through a resilience framework as deeply as experts in this new profession and the workers that everyone was waiting for. So we hope to grow this work, and would love to hear how this is resonating here in Hawaii.
Okay. We have a question back here.
Thank you. Amazing, very inspiring. Thank you so much. So I was taking notes, and you said public investment needs to begin before the disaster happens. I think you mean around the climate resilience technician and maybe around community organizing, but can you speak more towards that?
Yes, I couldn't quite hear you very well. You're asking what public investment in resilience might mean before the disaster. Yeah. So, we are very used to, and it's sort of in the national muscle memory, that when a disaster happens, money pours in to fix homes and communities, to get them back to the way we were. But in pockets of the country, people are beginning to realize that we need to be prepared before the disaster. What we're trying to do is translate that preparation into professional opportunities, translate that preparedness into the possibility of year-round work. And so some of the work, so there's three kinds of work that our professionals are doing. Some are preparing communities by going door to door, by listening, by knowing deeply the residents, in that community. And it's usually people from that community who are hired in that community. Some people are preparing the built environment, all the homes we live in, the schools our children go to. As money is coming in to make the built environment resilient, we're trying to make sure those turn into high-wage jobs that can support families in long-term careers. And then the example I just gave is an example of the natural environment, land management and other practices that prepare the natural environment, and in a way repair the natural environment to a former state before the incursion of industry and construction. Those are three major openings to move a program that can translate into large numbers of well-paying jobs for people who have been historically disadvantaged.
The built environment, let's go to that specifically. Could you describe some of the jobs that these people do that you train?
Yes, absolutely. So, this weekend, the past weekend, we were in Morgan City, and there were two kinds of jobs people were doing. One resilience worker who grew up and lived in Morgan City, who was a local person in that town, worked as an outreach worker. The mayor of the city gave us the entire list of every resident who had called City Hall asking for help. As you can imagine, this mayor was completely overwhelmed. When I met him 3 days after the hurricane, he looked like a truck rode over him, and that's how any mayor would look after a disaster. The city resources were completely overwhelmed. The city, every city official was out there handing out ice, but residents were calling, and a list developed of hundreds of people, and the city needed help. They needed people to go to the doors. We formed a group of resilience workers to go door to door to figure out what every resident needed, and to start tracking the residents and case managing the residents' experience of government supports and help, to navigate through the maze of applications and options and kinds of money and eligibility and rules, and particularly focusing those efforts on, the people who would be deeply disadvantaged if they didn't fix their homes right away. So that was the door-to-door street outreach that we were doing. During the pandemic, we ran that kind of outreach program for 2 years, and every single resilience worker who went through that outreach program for those 2 years, earning, $24 an hour and above, wound up getting permanent jobs in that kind of work afterwards, armed with that training. So that's one kind of job. Another is something you might expect more, which is just the physical act of rebuilding a home. Rebuilding a home after a flood or a fire. Well, fires are a whole other thing because there is nothing more final than a fire. And wherever I've been, those homes have vanished. There is nothing left. But after flooding, the house is in disrepair and needs to be essentially resuscitated back to life. It needs to be saved. There are many, many phases of that, and we train workers on how to do that, and we set high standards and wages as they do that. So those are two examples of kinds of jobs.
Thanks, Saket. Really excellent. And what I love the most whenever I have the pleasure of listening to you, either in my car and podcast or in panels, you're an incredible storyteller, and you're able to give dimension to what is usually flattened to numbers and stats and such. And so I really appreciate that, especially too when you were talking about FEMA. Because again, that is sort of the antagonist in a story, but it's really an apparatus that's about authorities and funding lines and politics on some level. I would love to take it down to another layer. Where does the state play into this? Oftentimes states can present impermeable or sometimes orthogonal kinds of antagonists. And I wonder, in your experience, if different states are doing things in different ways that are more or less helpful. Because Louisiana in some ways seems to be a classic example of where you might get some tensions at different scales. But in practice or philosophy, are there states that are doing it well, and what can we learn here?
Yeah, Maxine, thank you for that question. And I'm sure there's a lot of expertise in this room, so please, the invitation is to sort of join me in thinking this through. What I've seen, what my team and I have seen is that you're right. So the role of the federal government largely is to make a grant to the state. The state then carries out the work. There are federal, frontline workers who come down to assess and help navigate the paid, help. But largely the long-term recovery is the state's job. And I've seen a spectrum of responses. I think the fact that California is now putting money into pre-disaster resilience work, taking hundreds of acres of land and managing that land in a way that is less flammable, and and funding the idea that homes would be more resilient to wildfires. That's an extraordinarily positive thing. It's incredibly positive. I think that it's necessarily going to be where where everybody goes. The state of Florida created an insurer of last resort, a public insurance company. The state of Louisiana, created that too. Those are incredibly positive. Louisiana recently passed a measure that creates funds for people with old roofs to replace them with new metal roofs. That is going to change the lives of those residents. That's incredible. There are also significant and extraordinary gaps. We've seen incredible examples of, states advantaging some people through recovery efforts and disadvantaging others, or just letting the market do its job, and then the market advantages people who live in places with higher property values and disadvantages others. You know, in the post-Katrina New Orleans, in the post-Katrina Gulf Coast, rather, my team and I would go miles into the forest, into the bayou, to find the trailer parks where people had been placed, you know, after they had to evacuate from New Orleans, far away from their jobs, separated from their families. Those are all state decisions. I would say the biggest sort of hurdle, I think, coming forward is that there is a sense, a kind of a fantasy that all of this resilience can be done on the cheap, that all of this resilience can be built without, you know, without money behind it. So while the policy measures are great, Louisiana's payout to residents to fix their roofs or replace their roofs is about the third of the cost of a roof. No resident can afford a new roof with the paltry sum that the state is giving. As a result, with the result that the only people taking advantage of the program are the wealthy, because they've got $17,000 lying around and they can self-fund the rest. But no poor person has that kind of money, and so they can't even get started. And that's where we see the inequalities get built into the resilient system. The other fantasy out there is that volunteers are going to do everything. Now, I've been a volunteer, and volunteers do a lot, but nothing will replace the need for skilled, trained professionals at scale for a long time. And the reality is, if you want to keep those people, you have to pay them well. And so that's another gap. So I think there's you know, a patchwork of very, very good things happening. There are hundreds of points of light. And to turn that into a system, to scaffold that into a system, we have to get over some of the very old narratives in our, you know, in our nation's history. There is still an enormous resistance where I work most in Louisiana and Florida, for example, to the idea of public money being given out for resilience. And we now have, you know, the next generation climate welfare queen myth, you know, that says that these are handouts to the poor and therefore they will never work hard to get their home insured. Well, except that there are no insurers for miles around. So I think those are some of the challenges.
I wanted to call out or speak for just a moment about a corollary to the problems of the disaster economy, which sometimes involves billions of dollars of FEMA money flowing in and billions of dollars extracted out. And that relates in a way quite similarly to the way the flow of tourist dollars can work in many economies, in that multinationals end up taking it, tourists come in and they spend a lot of money, but a lot of it goes out, their single biggest expenses on their accommodations. But there's one force that enables Hawaii to capture a greater portion of the revenue that tourists spend, and those are the unions that ensure that many, at least some of the hotels pay a living wage. And I just we want to recognize some of the workers who are on strike to kind of maintain that higher level of service, and to make sure that some of those tourist dollars stay not just in their pockets because they work hard and deserve it, but also that some of those dollars stay in Hawaii. So it's kind of important to the economy for all of us. So we just wanted to recognize some of these Local 5 workers who are on strike right now.
Hi everyone, my name is Santai. I am representing Local 5. I am a housekeeper at Hilton Hawaiian Village. Although I haven't been working there for a long time, it's very stressful, it's very hard work. I haven't been able to get any benefits, but they are still deducting benefits from my paycheck, so I can't even get it. So we're fighting for job security also. There are many workers who's been there for more than 30, 40 years who have been let go just because, they're getting old, they can't do the job, and they're late from like traffic. It's very stressful. So we thank you guys for inviting us here. We appreciate you guys. Sorry, my voice is a little raspy. We've been on the picket line for 10 days now. But yeah, thank you very much.
I just want to say that if you want to start your day with a dose of faith in humanity, you should go at 7 a.m. to their picket line at the Hilton, where striking workers have been up all night and in the morning are celebrating each other and the guests and the possibility of dignity. So thank you so much for standing up.
Thank you. Very, very enlightening and interesting conversation. As you know, that the situation at different states and different communities are very different, right? So I'm listening to your talk and I'm thinking, okay, how can we apply this to the state of Hawaii and the situation that we face here? And so I was wondering if you could share maybe what you think as very important critical capacity one should have to start that kind of initiative based on your experience.
Well, I would never want to, I think it's really local people in a place that have the vision for what they need. And I think that a lot of capacity has to be put behind them, so that organized communities can reach back into history and navigate a way forward. I think that's really important. I do think that the possibility of exchange between communities is an incredibly important and rich one. And there are commonalities. And one commonality that I see is that we have to set priorities for our recoveries. We have to set long-term priorities for recoveries and resilience. And, this is especially important right now because the world of resilience is going the way that healthcare went. So many insurance companies, so many insurers are fleeing the housing market. And in the next 3 to 5 years, maybe less, the lack of insurance and the fragility to climate change, just in your home. Forget about debates about climate change and their causes, forget about whether it's end times or science. Leave that out for a second. Just the idea that half a year, most Americans with basements will live in flooded basements, just that fact is bound to become a bread and butter election issue, right? It is going to become a political issue. And it's going to be not just in Louisiana, but in Michigan, in places like that. And at that point, there's going to have to be a truly national resilience framework that reimagines how public investments are really made, not just in disaster restoration, which is all we have now, but in true resilience. Just like there had to be a public option or something close to it in healthcare. When it comes time to cast around for where that model comes from, when it was time to build the ACA, the federal government looked at Massachusetts as a model. Of course, it wasn't happening only in Massachusetts. One of the places it was happening was here, but in the national imagination, we looked at Massachusetts. I think we have a profound opening for Hawaii to be one of the places, perhaps the place, that we look at models of resilience so that this state can form and its communities can be the author of the policy, so that there's scaffolding from here. The fact that Hawaii and California are both facing fires and floods, the fact that communities are unlocking indigenous and ancestral knowledge to rewrite the rules and come up with solutions, that's really extraordinary. most other places in the country, recovery and resilience is left to the market. And we need places where people and communities and their local governments and their state are the co-authors. And I think that's the real urgency that I feel is absolutely what's tugging at people, what's going to be really the most important to people is their home, their land, their coastline, where they live, where they've lived for centuries. That's absolutely really important. But you all can also provide a path forward to us all, and I hope that there's going to be some capacity thrown behind the possibility of doing that. Because the alternative, let me tell you, is that Louisiana will do it. And that is a purely market-driven solution that's not going to be enough for our communities. So that's what I would say.
Okay. Just for time's sake, we only have time for one more question. But before we get into the last question, I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Please be sure to stay back for our book signing. We have cookies and tea as well. And then also be sure to fill out a survey and tell us how we did.
Mahalo, Saket. Thank you so much for coming here. So I work in the climate change space, and as you were saying, these opportunities is exactly how I see climate change. It's not just an opportunity to become resilient to climate change, to mitigate against climate change, but to actually shift our way of living and our societies so that we're uplifting our entire communities. I loved what you said about the opportunity for Hawaii to be an example, and just wondering, how can we help to nurture that and bring that so that we can have this knowledge exchange between us here as a smaller state that often gets left behind on the national scale, but how can we use what we've learned here and share that with our communities on the continent?
Well, first of all, thank you for all your work on climate. And it reminds me that, years ago when we started this work, we were in a lot of conversations where our friends in the climate justice movement told us to tread very carefully, because justifiably there was so much conversation and activism and prioritization around mitigation, around keeping carbon in the ground, and taking on the fossil fuel industry. There was a sense that maybe starting to talk about resilience too soon would be a concession to the forces behind climate change. That wasn't a discouragement to us from doing the work, but we were just asked to keep that in mind, I'm amazed at how much that has changed. I think people have really come around to the idea that what we call mitigation in the climate world and adaptation are very deeply related. They're deeply related on the ground because the same storm-proof window that my members install in Florida, can reduce the carbon footprint of that house, and it can make that house stronger to face the next storm. I think those worlds are getting closer and closer together as well in community organizing, in the world of policy. And I wonder if that's the opening, the possibility that we've got a more cohesive movement, that different parts of the movement are talking to each other more. And I wonder if that's the basis for an exchange. I absolutely think that, I go to a lot of rooms where people are dismissive of mutual aid after disasters. That it's just people helping people, and it washes away after a while. And it's not enough to bring back a community. It's thought of sometimes as nice. And I think we should really turn that on its head. The spirit and emotional logic and the kind of incredible cooperation that you have after disasters as a result of mutual aid, through mutual aid, the idea of people helping people. It's not just pure of heart. it's actually a deeply intelligent level of cooperation that we see. It's deeply intelligent, it's strategic, it's extraordinary, and it's a little bit of a microcosm of the actual economy we need after disasters, the actual economy we need in the context of climate change, where there's much more interdependence, where people are much more tied to each other. And so I wonder if a way to start that discussion would be to map out some of these potential, interdependent members of one table and bring them together. Survivors, volunteers, professional workers, homeowners, local governments, all of them have a stake in resilience. And I think those kinds of conversations do show a way forward. I just want to say before I go, the last thing I want to do is just really recognize the University of Hawaii. Thank you for inviting me, and especially everyone around the Better Tomorrow speaker series, but especially Robert Perkinson, who has just kind of created this incredible space for conversation and created this whirlwind of meetings, which is amazing, these incredible conversations. Thank you, Robert, for having me, and thank you all.